my best spots are exactly what I just described. Because I know that they're going to be on those creeks, running up and down, and just trying to cross cut as many of those deer trails that are crossing the creek as possible. And then from there, it's just a simple a mathematical equation of try to find a spot where I could shoot the furthest and shoot across both sides.
Saw that. What is your approach after you've learned how these mature bucks are navigating based off what you've done in the tracking aspect?
The rut is really where you have your best shot. And what's interesting is a lot of the deer in the rut, they use a very specific pattern, and I'd almost have to sit down and show someone on a map, but they use almost like a cruising type of method where they're just trying to cross cut as many tracks as possible. Does and young bucks and everything else are kind of in a linear deer trail type of traveling pattern where a mature buck is going to try to cross cut as many of those trails as possible. So there's spots in a rut that I'll only hunt those spots in a rut. They're not going to be very useful other times of the year, but that's where I'm going to be, is trying to set up on some of these cruising type of transition lines that they use. And then late season, it gets back to tracking again.
So
it does change.
Okay. And one thing you mentioned, and we just actually, by the time this episode comes out, the episodes with Bobby Worthington have already come out. Our buddy Bobby from Tennessee, he's a big bow hunter, hunts traditional equipment, has hunted with compounds in the past, but he's a big funnel guy during the rut in more mountainous country. And one thing he likes is these long range funnels that he calls, where these deer are going, potentially miles down a mountain system. Yeah. And there's certain pinch points on those mountains. If you sit there, and if you can sit there 5, 6, 7 days, at some point you're going to have the opportunity of that big buck coming through there. And that's a lot of his premise. Now, with you, what do those rut travel corridors look like from a habitat standpoint? And is there anything visually you can see along that corridor that this buck is using specifically during the rut that you can key in on from a visual understanding, or is it more so based off just trail camera data?
It's a time of the year where that mature buck is officially going to let his guard down, and he wants to just find other deer. So up here, what that means is if they're getting out in the open more, and they use edges, like the edge of a cedar swamp, where you got a marsh and a cedar swamp meets, and you take that long edge for a mile or two, and deer are just going to be up and down it. And that's just because they're trying to cover as much ground and cut as many trails as possible. And it's very similar to your friend that you mentioned, like a long range funnel. It's very similar to that, and they're just taking a straight line. And they're in that zombie mode. Everybody knows what it looks like, where it's almost like their mind is lost and they're just going. And that is also when you want to sit all day long. The majority of the days I do hunt, I sit all day, but in the rut especially. And just like your friend said, where you sit up on a spot and you wait, and that's exactly the same thing I do. I have a couple stands that, wind dependent, of course, I'll get up in that stand and I'll just sit as many hours as I possibly can, as many days as I can. And that's typically how that's how I get to be successful in the rut, is just grinding it out, finding a spot that works and just waiting on them. Last year, for example, I sat 5 days in a row without seeing a deer, and then killed a 170-inch buck, shot him at 6 yards. But I trusted the spot. I trusted the reason I was sitting there, and I just grinded it out. And it gets pretty boring after a couple of days without seeing a single animal, but he eventually showed up. And if I would have lost my confidence after day 4, for example, I would have never killed the deer. So,
see, I want to get even more into this and trying to figure out more examples of that would translate to the south from the north, like talking like these long range. We're going to see that term that Bobby says, and like what you just mentioned, that long range funnel where they're able to parallel, where deer are cutting in and out of some cover type that maybe there's food in that cover, maybe there's food adjacent to it, but they're going back and forth, coming in and out. Like down here, we have a lot of clear cuts where we're at timber cuts,
Mhm.
and you see a lot of those does going in and out of it. And like you're saying, like the buck's kind of skirting the edge. Sometimes they're 5 yards into that cut. Sometimes they're on the edge of it. Sometimes they're a couple yards outside the edge of that cut, and they're kind of paralleling them and running them for a long ways. And
Mhm.
you're seeing the same thing up there. Is there is there any other features like habitat features that you'd want to see in and around whatever that cover type is that that buck's going to be running? And I'm guessing you're going to find sign along the edge of it too. But is there anything else like compounding habitat edges or water or anything else that makes it even that much better?
The big focus for me is creeks. Um, Deer, when they cross a creek up here, they usually cross it perpendicular, just because you have brush on either side of that creek. But a lot of the creeks up here, there's open marsh and open ground, say within 30 to 40 yards of that creek. So there's an opening. And, deer typically want to get from point A to point B, and they just go and cross the creek and they're gone. Where in a rut, the bucks will use those creek bottoms and they'll just go and they'll stay on an edge. But what I like to do is, say if you have a creek with a 100-yard wide marsh on either side, I'll look for a spot where that kind of bottlenecks down, just for the shot aspect of it. If a deer is on the other side of the creek, can I make that shot over to the other side and try to find where that necks down? My best spots are exactly what I just described, because I know that they're going to be on those creeks, running up and down, and just trying to cross cut as many of those deer trails that are crossing the creek as possible. And then from there, it's just a simple a mathematical equation of try to find a spot where I can shoot the furthest and shoot across both sides.
Funny, raw mathematics. That's something Bobby talked about in one of the episodes. He's like, deer hunting for a mature buck's all about mathematics. It's simple
It
math,
is.
and it's
It
all about
is.
statistics. And that's interesting. You brought that up as well. So also one other thing when you talk about creeks, like bucks running creeks, of course, this is something that's been discussed a bunch in different habitat types, like deer running creeks. But like, what kind of cover do you need to see along a creek in order for a buck to run it? Because there's some creeks that we know of that it is wide open creek bottom, like the covers 80 to 100 yards off the creeks next to maybe some of the timber
Mhm.
cunts, but the actual what we would call down here the SMZ stream side management zones, where the timber company can't cut to the creek. That buffer
Right.
zone is typically sometimes more open than others. In your area, are you trying to associate thicker cover, some kind of like edge cover running the creek as well?
Yeah. Some of the swamps up here they're so thick, they're almost to the point of being a spot where you don't want to walk. Uh, Cedar swamps, for example, are very thick, but they hold deer. So you do want to focus in on a creek or a river bottom that flows through an area with really heavy, thick cover. Because with wolves and everything else that go on up here, uh, deer are going to try to stay that thick cover, such as a cedar swamp. Yeah, so the vegetation matters. You don't want to be in a spot where it's just wide open. Willow brush, for example, is what we'd find in a lot of the spots up here. Deer tend to avoid those kind of spots. It's just too open. So
Now, also when you're talking about like the cover and the bucks running during the rut, is there how does sign reading play a factor for you on highlighting these spots? Like I'm sure some of these spots you kind of like your honey holes, like you've learned them and you've got a good feeling for them, and you kind of have certain areas you go back to. But if you were starting fresh again and looking at these habitat edges and everything, what would you need to see either from previous year or in that season to tell you like this is worth my time and there's a mature buck using this habitat edge and running that edge?
it's one of those things where it's like fishing. You roll out the dead water, and sometimes it takes some days where you're not catching any fish to do that. You know, Time spent in the woods matters. So a lot of the spots that I traditionally use were found either on purpose or by mistake, but it was you know uh, getting out there and seeing it with my own eyes. And from a scouting perspective, it's boots on the ground, and when you walk it, you're looking obviously for first off the most deer sign you can find. Up here, there's wolves and heavy predator type of situation, the deer will avoid it altogether, or they're all dead. They're killed off. So up here, first thing I'm looking for is deer sign as a rule of thumb, and then from there, narrowing it down, scouting, tree stand time, just time in the woods. But it takes a while. It's not something that you walk in and immediately you're successful. It takes some time. And if you are successful year one, there's probably a lot of luck on your side. It's not easy ground, but there are mature deer to be had. So,
what other examples would you have of funnels that you'll focus on both for trail camera use, but also for potential pre-rut activity?
As far as funnels are concerned, water up here plays a big factor. There is a lot of water up here. So if you get in spots where it just looks like spaghetti thrown on a map with water, they're going to try to traverse through there the easiest way possible. But there's also, it's like looking at a maze where you have dead ends. So you have to avoid spots where the deer are just going to dead end to nothing. But yeah, water is a huge part of the funnels that I'm looking for, very specific to water in particular. And then of course, vegetation be second to that. Small amount of elevation change. Elevation change is a thing in some spots, but most often what I'm hunting is dead flat.
Well, one thing I'm thinking of, because I'm looking, I've got a couple different pieces of public in mind in the South that we've hunted that are more swamp, river bottom habitats. And I'm trying to think about, like, based off this conversation, like how it might change my perspective of hunting some of those areas, because they all produce really high quality deer. It's just the biggest factor for them, just kind of thinking about them, in a lot of them, you have large expanses of wide open timber, big timber. And then, you'll get some water and you get brush along the water. Or you'll find like where a bunch of big trees are down and then like it's a thicker area there. It's not like the overall abundance. There's some areas that we hunt, there's more abundance of thicker cover than others, but a lot of them, it's like the cover is almost more isolated than the open woods are. In circumstances like that, what would be your thought or understanding of running through that cover and spot checking in order to try to figure out your absolute best areas that, first off, a mature buck could survive, but also where a mature buck would feel extremely safe moving through a cover type like that?
In a situation like that, you're talking big, wide open woods where everything is very similar and a deer can pretty much walk anywhere. That gets tough. But what I would try to focus in on there is the vegetation change. You're going to find an edge somewhere. Eventually that big wide open woods is going to change into something else. I would start looking. I always like to try to find an edge, but the other thing I would look at there is where you're going to find your thickest areas. I'm kind of piecing together what you're talking about in my mind as you're talking. It sounds like a big wide open expansive woods that just covers a lot of ground, and it's very similar in make all the way through it. Somewhere along the lines, you're going to have a spot that's thicker than the rest. I would focus there, focus on the edges. That doesn't mean you can't kill a deer right square in the middle of that timber, but that is going to be tough. With a bow in your hand, it's going to be very tough. You have to try to figure out a way to get that deer close. So that to me is an edge, that thick area, transition line, something of that nature.
And that's kind of where I'm thinking of, because there's a lot of those woods when I'm thinking about when I've walked, done big loops through a lot of that stuff, where it is early season when there's leaves on all those big trees. There's a little bit more understory and the deer kind of just meander throughout. The second the leaves come off, it's like you could walk through there, and if you find sign and you can see 250 yards, more than it is not during daylight hours. It is sometime in the middle of the night, more than likely. So it's like, it's almost a double-edged sword where there's a lot you can almost X off when the leaves come off and it's during the rut. But also there's a lot that there's a smaller percentage of areas, smaller percent of the landscape that is more likely going to have the higher pockets of those deer. And again, trying to figure out how those deer can navigate through there.